On September 16, 2022, the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal had the great pleasure of having Dr. Ruth Wodak as our virtual lecture speaker. Ruth Wodak is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University, UK, and affiliated to the University of Vienna. In June 2021, she was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for her lifetime achievements. She is a member of the editorial board for a range of linguistic journals and co-editor of the journals Discourse in Society, Critical Discourse Studies, and Language and Politics. Her research interests focus on discourse studies, gender studies, identity politics and the politics of the past, political communication and populism, prejudice and discrimination, and on ethnographic methods of linguistic fieldwork. Her talk was titled Normalizing Far-Right Discourses, Analyzing the Micro-Politics of Far-Right Populism.
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Like I said, you're welcome to say hello in the chat box and tell us where you're joining us from if you'd like. Thank you so much for attending this virtual lecture series hosted by the Studies in Applied Linguistics and TESOL journal, also known as SALT. We are so excited and honored that for our first event of this academic year, we're joined by Dr. Ruth Wodak. Before I introduce our speaker, I will share a bit of information about the journal and the logistics of today's lecture. So my name is Kelly France. I'm the journal editor of SALT, and we're also joined today by the journal's faculty advisors, Dr. Hanson Waring and Dr. Vivian Linhardson. Hello, thank you. And we're joined by DU and Sean Hughes, who will be helping to monitor the Q&A portion of this lecture. So thank you all so much for being here today. To share a bit about SALT, we're an open access journal that publishes full-length peer-reviewed articles that deal with language, language use, language acquisition, language teaching, and language assessment. Since its inception in 2001, the SALT journal has published quality empirical studies, literature reviews, book reviews, forums, and interviews, and we publish biannually, so in May and in December. I encourage you to explore our website to see some of our recent publications and even consider submitting your own work. Our journal is also indexed by Academic Commons, Columbia University, Directory of Open Access Journals, Education Resources Information Center, and also Google Scholar. In addition to our biannual publications, the SALT journal is committed to fostering discussions within the Applied Linguistics and TESOL community. So we regularly host academic lectures, presentations, and workshops by both established and up-and-coming scholars in the field. And I encourage you to follow us on social media if you aren't already doing so, and stay tuned for announcements about future events. So moving into the lecture we have planned for today, a couple of logistics. Since this is webinar style, you can participate in a few ways. Please send questions for the speaker through the Q&A box, and we'll have time for questions at the end. So during the talk, as you think of questions, you can send them along in the Q&A box and we'll review them at the end. If you'd like to send comments to all the participants, you can send those in the chat box. You can say hello in the chat box. At the time of the Q&A, we'll go through the questions that you've posted in the Q&A box. And also, if you'd like to speak your question, you can press the raise hand button. If you'd like closed captioning, you can also enable that feature. So without further ado, it's my pleasure and great privilege to introduce to you Dr. Ruth Wodak, who is Emerita Distinguished Professor of Discourse Studies at Lancaster University. She's also affiliated to the University of Vienna. Professor Wodak is known for her groundbreaking work on Austrian and European identity politics, politics of the past, gender studies, political communication, populism, prejudice, and discrimination, to name a few. She's received numerous awards and accolades, so let me just mention a few of the more recent ones that recognize her lifetime achievements. She's a member of the Academia Europea and the British Academy of Social Sciences. In 2018, for her outstanding work in promoting gender equality, she was awarded the prestigious Lebensweg Prize, the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Austrian Ministry of Women's Affairs. And in June 2021, she was awarded the Bruno Kreisky Prize for her lifetime achievements in research and publication. Some of Professor Wodak's recent publications include her second edition of the book Politics of Fear, The Shameless Normalization of Far-Right Discourse, and she's also recently co-authored a book with Marcus Reindorf called Identity Politics, Past and Present, Political Discourses from Post-War Austria to the COVID Crisis, which was published this year. And while I could go on, I know you all came to hear from Professor Wodak herself. So today her talk is titled Normalizing Far-Right Discourses, Analyzing the Micro-Politics of Far-Right Populism. Without further ado, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Ruth Wodak.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great honor. And I would love to be there face-to-face, but I think webinars are quite a good development to enable us also to correspond and speak with each other from far away. Right now I'm situated in Vienna and it's 4:30 in the afternoon. Without further ado, I will try and share my screen now, and I hope that works as it did before. Yep. And would just like to say a few words before I start with all the slides in my lecture. I asked about what kind of topic would be interesting, and of course this isn't quite the topic for applied linguistics in the sense of language teaching and language assessment, but you will be astonished, and I will talk about that later on. It is actually very much so in this area, because language skills and language competence in sort of the language of host countries have become gatekeeper for migrants and refugees, and for getting citizenship, and especially the far right have been very careful and adamant to make language skills and testing as difficult as possible. So in my book, which Kelly mentioned, I have a chapter also dedicated to this question. So in that way, I think my topic fits actually into this specific area as well. So I want to talk about normalizing far-right discourses. I will come to the definition of what I mean with normalizing in a minute. I think all of you will recognize that, having lived through 4 years of Donald Trump. But I'm not so much talking about Trump and Trumpism. I'm basically talking about European far-right populist parties, which have been around for a long time, actually very soon after the end of World War II. The French far-right populist party and the Austrian one, the Freedom Party, were the first in Europe already in the 1940s and 1950s. So this phenomenon has been around for a very long time. And as you all know, since the end of the 20th century and with the beginning of the 21st century, far-right populist parties have become ever stronger, and larger. And right now we have witnessed the Sweden Democrats, which is a far-right populist party, drawing on neo-Nazi ideologies, which has become the second strongest party in Sweden at the election last Sunday. So we're actually talking about a phenomenon which is very prominent and has been around for a long time, but has become ever more relevant and important since the 1990s and 2000. So what I want to do in this lecture, where of course there are many aspects which I will not be able to talk about, and I have to focus on a few. I will first talk about what I mean with normalization to the right, what I mean with certain dimensions, aspects, arguments, normalizing. I will then talk about characteristics of far-right populist rhetoric, about performance, and about the discourse. And I will give you some examples. And finally, we can also talk about strategies, what we could do to contest this normalization. So what do I mean with normalization to the right? This is important in the sense of discourse and language change, but of course it's also a change of certain practices. And these are shifts within a political landscape through the mechanisms of normalizing what is non-normal. So what is non-normal? Non-normal are certain areas, arguments, quotations, slogans, which are taboo in a society, which don't belong to the conventions, which have been tradition. Not everything has to be written down, but we know what politeness conventions are. We know what certain conventions of dialogue are, but we also know what conventions are, like certain treaties which have been signed by many countries, etc. So the shifts can actually happen in all these areas, and suddenly we are confronted with certain arguments, ideologies, slogans, conventions which have become accepted and which were not accepted before. These can be all kinds of norms. These can be, as I said, something which was taboo and looked at as being very negative, but it can also be something which is positive. For example, positive, the rights of LGBTQ groups and people, but it can also be very negative, like insults or very sexist expressions, xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic, and so forth. So the normalization can actually relate to both negative and positive conventions which have been non-accepted or tabooed or situated at the margins. This can work via single words, but also entire semantic fields, and also the practices related to these semantic fields. And basically, we can say that the boundaries of what can be said have changed, that the political culture has changed. I'm talking now mostly about the field of politics. And what I will also talk about is what I have put in the title of the second edition of my book, which Kelly mentioned, which is the shamelessness. When certain utterances are mentioned, which transgress and violate all conventions and rules of politeness, or have started to insult people but have become acceptable. So we can then look at, and I think this is also very important to think about, is what does this normalization achieve? It achieves that we suddenly have something which people actually would like to have, which they have fantasies about, which is called the new normal. Now, the new normal is probably a slogan which all of us have heard quite a few times during the pandemic. Everybody was waiting and hoping for something which would be the new normal, similar to what we had had before, but of course changed because many new aspects have to be integrated. And so it's a discourse about society's future, and people would like this put into practice. And different political parties have different programs about what this post-crisis imaginary, what this new normal could be. So we have visions, expectations of future development, but also drawing on the past, a certain nostalgia, and going back to times before, let's say, the pandemic, some other crisis, or as we know, make Austria great again, or America great again, or other countries great again, a certain context, a situation which had been there before something else happened, very frequently really just a certain imaginary, because such visions probably didn't exist. And a part of this process of normalization, which we see here, is that political, ideological positions become naturalized and are not challenged anymore. And I think this is what is interesting for linguists of all kinds, that we think about how does that happen, and how do these new language rules and norms become acceptable. I just want to show you a slide where I have put together various headlines of British tabloids, where it is about migration. And migration was a big issue, as many of you might know, during the campaign for or against Brexit 2016, when then finally Britain left the European Union. And one of the big issues was that the Brexiteers said there were too many migrants, too many strangers coming to the United Kingdom, and especially that they didn't speak the English language, that they were getting more social housing than the British, that they were violent, raping the women, that they were invading like a tsunami, like a natural catastrophe which you couldn't stop. And all these stereotypes became prevalent and were used again and again and repeated in discourses about strangers, and especially about migrants. Interestingly, and we can talk about that later in the discussion, if you go to Great Britain right now, you will find out that all these migrants are actually missed because there are not enough people working in certain professions, like in restaurants or in agriculture or other professions, and many restaurants, hotels, and shops have had to close because they don't have people who would want to work there. So getting rid of all these migrants probably has actually been not very good for the British economy. So let me now turn to the discourse, which has certain characteristics. But first, it is important to define what I mean with far-right populism. Populism has become a flag word. It's used in very many contexts and means all kinds of stuff. So I think we need to define it very carefully. And we also need to distinguish between left-wing and far-right populism. Many researchers now actually avoid the term populism and talk about the radical right. I think that is still something different, and I will immediately explain why. But for me, it's very important to really always distinguish between the far right and the left, because every politician per se must be populist in some way or other. And they always address their audience as we, they address their opponents as them. They always actually divide people into dichotomies, into us and them, and certain strategies are used by many politicians. So it's not just about the rhetorical strategies, it's also about the contents. And discourse is always about form and content. I think this is very important to keep in mind when we talk about political communication. So what is a definition about far-right populism? I'm citing a Bulgarian researcher, and I think her definition is very plausible. Right-wing populism is an expression and catalyst for the transition from class politics to value politics. So it's not the traditional narratives which are still important, but much more a battle about values, a battle about symbols. So she says it's a transition from party politics to symbolic politics, and I'll give you some examples in a minute, and a transition from the traditional classical ideologies to identity politics. I think this is something we experience globally, and especially also a transition from socioeconomic issues and cleavages to cultural cleavages. So this being same or different has become much more important than issues of inequality, for example. So let me start with one of the typical strategies. And here I do have an example also of Donald Trump, but also one of Berlusconi, who I think has really a large similarity to Trump. You will remember, I guess all of you, that Donald Trump on the 23rd January 2016, speaking at a rally in Iowa during the US presidential election campaign, commented on the loyalty of his own supporters as follows: "I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters." So if what is presupposed here is that Donald Trump could actually kill somebody and nothing would happen to him, because, and that is also presupposed, he is above law. And this is something which is not just, doesn't just relate to Donald Trump, but also to Silvio Berlusconi, who was the Italian prime minister for a long time and actually wants to come back now again in the vote in the election in Italy, which is taking place in a few weeks. And Berlusconi on the 6th November 2008 held a joint press conference in Moscow in Russia with the then Russian President Dmitry Medvedev. And when he was asked about his perception of the future relationships between the US and Russia in view of the election of Barack Obama, Berlusconi replied, Obama has all that needed to get on with him, i.e. Medvedev, because he's young, he's handsome, and even tanned. So he made a joke about the fact that Obama is not white, and made a joke about this, that was actually due to being in the sun. And of course, that was an insult to bring this into the foreground in that way. Now, the difference between, one of the differences between Berlusconi and Trump in that case was that Berlusconi afterwards, when asked about this joke, apologized, whereas, as we know, Trump never apologized for his insults and just continued to speak or even started with a new provocation. Now, provocations are very important. Scandalization and provocation is very important as a rhetorical strategy for the far right. Why? Because they always want to be in the headlines in media, and in that way, he was very successful, especially also, as we know, with using tweets. And a journalist once told me that his way of working had changed completely, because now he even had to get up in the middle of the night and look and see what Trump maybe had tweeted during the night and write about it. So everybody was basically running after those tweets, and they weren't controlled by the fourth estate, by the media. Everybody basically can now have their own media. And if you're powerful, if you're the president, then you know that you will get the attention of the media. Berlusconi, in a very different way, owned most of the media in Italy. And in that way, he was sure that he would basically always be present in the media. But other far-right leaders try to provoke, scandalize as often as they can, because they know that the tabloids, but not only the tabloids, the media will always write about them. And that is a big problem, because in that way, what they say is disseminated and repeated all over, recontextualized. And of course, this is not what some of the media want. But if you don't repeat it, they might be accused of not being objective, of not writing what the politicians say, etc. So you have to find a balance. You don't always have to put it into headlines, and sometimes you could also ignore it. So it's a difficult, as I said, balance to find, and I think journalists have to be very aware of what they do when they basically repeat everything and put it into the headlines. So what do these far-right politicians do? They basically divide the world into the us, who are good, honest, beautiful, noble, brave, trustworthy, and also the victims of the bad, and the bad people who are lazy, evil, cowardly, criminal, the others. And the others can be situated in various locations. They can be up there, the elites, and we all know that the populists, the far right, but also the left-wing populists fight against the elites, against those up there, and presuppose that those up there don't listen to the people. But they can also be outside, the migrants who are criminal, who are said to be illegal, etc. And they can also be down there. That means the poor people, the spongers, those who don't want to work, the homeless, etc. So the we are basically perceived as being attacked from three sides, and that's why they have to fight back. And the habitus of most of the far-right populists is basically a campaign habitus, a fighting habitus against all these different opponents up there, outside, and below. I think this is quite a good way to map out the way these far-right populists perceive the world. Other rhetorical strategies, I just list a few, are conspiracies. So someone has to be to blame, someone is working against them, they are the victims. We also call that turning the tables. They speak on behalf and like the people. This is the so-called ad populum argument, and we talk about authenticity in this case. And some politicians are better than others in doing that, in the way that they don't talk down to the people, but actually talk in the dialect, in the style, in the conversational style, like the people. And I think this is something which is usually not recognized by many people, but I think it's very relevant that this kind of authenticity is part and parcel of the linguistic style which is being used. And many people who I have interviewed before I wrote the book have told me that it's important that they feel accepted, acknowledged, recognized, and not talked down to. So I think this is a very important strategy. Another important strategy is the promise of salvation and liberation, what we call the topos, the argument of the savior. So somebody is saving us, somebody promises to save us, to solve all the problems, and who knows who basically is guilty, who's to blame. And I think that is part of this habitus of the election campaign, where most politicians promise a lot, but the far-right populists basically create themselves and perform as saviors and liberators. What I also call the dead cat strategy, this is a very well-known rhetorical strategy, is to provide distraction. So if in a certain debate or when implementing certain policies, far-right politicians notice that something might be unacceptable, they provide distraction by provoking with something else. And that's a metaphor in the sense that somebody during a debate would throw a dead cat on the table, and of course everybody would start talking about this dead cat. And finally, what also Benjamin Moffat has called the bad manners, that means flouting all the Gricean principles, breaking taboos, being anti-political correctness, insulting, swearing, etc., saying sexist, racist, anti-Semitic, xenophobic things intentionally, and in that way, again, provoking, scandalizing, and being sure to be on the headlines. So just to briefly talk about the argument structure, which I think is very important in this context. The use of the so-called topoi, which are, to say it in simple language, like a shortcut of the usual argument, which has a three-part structure, and they allude to common sense. So I have put an example here. Migrants are coming too many to Austria and Sweden. All of us know this is assumed and presupposed and part of the common sense which has been established. They are criminal, cost too much, exploit our benefits, etc. That implies, and we conclude, they need to be kept outside. And there are many such common sense arguments which don't even have to be have to have some evidence, and which are used by many politicians all the time. I've put up a whole list here, like providing for so many refugees places a too big burden on Austrians, therefore Austria should only accept a limited number, the topos of burden, and that presupposes that there are so many refugees, but there's no evidence, and no evidence is given about numbers, for example. Another very prominent argument is about culture. They are uneducated, illiterate, they don't belong to us, and that's why they are such a big burden, or the topos of history. For example, the Geneva Convention, which tells us how to treat refugees, was designed for a different historical situation. Therefore, we are now not bound by it. And very importantly, the topos of danger. Some of the people who are arriving now might become terrorists, are already terrorists, therefore we should close our borders. So all of this relates and talks to some common sense knowledge, some assumptions, some attitudes, and enforces them. And if these topoi are repeated frequently, then they are also disseminated. And as I showed you, they are in the headlines of tabloids. And in that way, many people believe non-evidence, non-factual assumptions. Another important concept which has been created and put forward by a German sociologist, Wilhelm Heckmeyer, is what we call coarse civility. That means such explicit utterances as we have seen them on the tabloids are not used by many politicians in more formal situations. And in that way, they are cloaked in what we call a soft discriminatory way, and they become indirect or implicit. You can also exclude and discriminate against people in a civilized way. And I will show you some examples of how that happens. So let me first come to provocation, scandalization. Here is one poster put forward by the Austrian Freedom Party. And what it says here, I translate the German slogan: the government will cut the money for children outside of Austria. What this implies is that children of migrants who work in Austria would receive less money than children of Austrians who work in Austria. Now that goes against many laws also put forward by the European Union of equality, of having to treat everybody in the same way. It doesn't matter if this is a child of a Romanian or Polish worker who work in Austria, or of somebody with Austrian citizenship. But in that way, they actually enforced and triggered a lot of resentment. Why do those people get as much as we get? We are the real people. We are Austrians. The others shouldn't get as much. And on top of creating and triggering resentment, they put a woman into this poster as being sort of a typical child of migrants, who isn't a child of the typical migrant working in Austria, because she is not Polish or Hungarian or Romanian or somebody from other EU countries. This is a picture of a woman from Somalia. And what they wanted to do is enforce the resentment by also triggering anti-Muslim sentiments. How do they do that? By the headscarf, which this woman has. So the headscarf has become a symbol of what we, the Austrians, don't want. Now, interestingly, this law, which was put forward by the then government, has had to be taken back. It's not valid anymore because the European Court decided that all children are equal. All children of people working, paying taxes, abiding to the law, wherever they come from, have to get the same amount of money. And that caused a huge debate, as you can imagine. And in that way, this was a case of establishing disinformation, of using something which different picture, which did not fit into this whole narrative, but triggered even more resentment. Another example is the use of euphemisms, something already George Orwell pointed to long ago. In 2018, Austria had a government which consisted of National Conservative Party and the far-right populists. And what they did was rename arrival centers. Those were refugees arrived, refugees being different from migrants because refugees are protected by the Geneva Convention. They come from somewhere where they have to flee. Nobody leaves. Nobody really likes to leave, but those people had to leave. They had to flee and had very difficult trajectories. And they finally arrive in a country where they apply for asylum, and they arrive at arrival centers where they then can apply for asylum. And those arrival centers were renamed as departure centers. Now, you might say, okay, this is just a change of wording. No, it's not just a change of wording. It actually is a change, a symbolic change in the sense that it doesn't welcome people, it tells them to leave. So you could, instead of being welcomed here in the center, you arrive here, you arrive and you're told this is the center where you depart from. And as we know, people from 2015, for example, from Syria and Iraq, many people arrived in Europe and in the European Union. Austria, Germany, and Sweden were the countries who took most of those people, but the far right wanted to close the borders. The same is happening now with refugees from Ukraine, where some are welcomed, but others are not welcomed. And this departure center should signal that, okay, we don't want you, we want you to leave again. And interestingly, in the now government, which we have in Austria, which is National Conservative Coalition with the Green Party, and the Green Party was always the party for human rights and for granting asylum, these arrival centers are renamed as return centers. So another euphemism actually for you shouldn't be here, we want you to leave, or even we will deport you. So euphemisms, as George Orwell has already showed in 1984 in his famous book, or in his essay about the political language, shows that euphemisms are used a lot to cloak and cover up uncomfortable facts. And I recommend reading that again because it tells us a lot about also the Russian propaganda right now, where you're not allowed to talk about war, but only about special operations. And it actually resembles many of the examples which we found in Orwell's writing. And an example of course civility, where again 2015-16, the time when so many refugees came to Europe under terrible circumstances, sometimes barefoot, sometimes just carrying one plastic bag with some food or clothing. And our then Prime Minister said, it is understandable that many politicians are afraid of ugly pictures of border security. That means of pictures where people are not allowed to enter into the country, or are pushed back, or are locked up, or children are separated from their parents, and so forth. But this Prime Minister Kurz said we cannot transfer this job to Turkey, which actually then happened, because we don't want to get our hands dirty. It won't go without ugly pictures. That means everybody has to become used to ugly pictures, which again then means those ugly pictures become normalized. They become acceptable. They are not scandalous anymore. People don't say, this is terrible, we have to help these people. They just become part of everyday life. And that is the same with the other examples which I showed you, putting false disinformation into posters becomes acceptable, using euphemisms to cover up exclusion and discrimination has become acceptable if even the Green Party agrees to it. So to show you in a kind of model or to make it plausible what happens, we have extreme right discourses, terms, suggestions, demands, arguments, proposals, utterances, symbols. They can also be visual symbols. And through processes of normalization, they are first talked about on backstage, and then they come to the front stage of politics, and then they go through various genres. So first, they might only be posted on social media, then maybe they are posted as a poster, they might be uttered in an interview, they might then be debated in parliament, and finally they may become part of legislation and be lastly and finally actually be part of some textbook where you learn about a certain area. They become part of mainstream discourses and politics. And this doesn't happen simultaneously. This happens in various shifts, as I said at the very beginning, where such normalization processes can be observed. So let me conclude. What is the far-right narrative, which we have become used to, but which actually should become contested? They presuppose that once upon a time there were three separate peoples, the us, a homogeneous people, which of course never was the case because there never existed such a homogeneous people, but that is the imaginary. And we, those far-right populists, these ethno-nationalists, we are helping to bring back that earlier and better order, that kind of status quo ante. And how do we do that? With repetition, as I showed you in the media, with the Manichaean division, dichotomies into us and them, by flouting and violating all conventional rules of negotiation, conversation, argumentation, everything which all our theorists, which we learn about in pragmatics, for example, are flouted. And finally, parallel discourse worlds and truths seem to exist. Uh, we have so-called alternative facts, and societies become polarized. Everybody believes in their truth and in their world, and there is no way to talk to each other anymore. And this has become part and parcel of many societies right now. So we observe the step-by-step transformation of pluralist, of liberal democracies. These are democracies where there are free elections, where you can say your opinion freely, and where legislation and law is independent, where the opposition might be able to win. Step-by-step transformation into more authoritarian states, and these visions of the far-right populist and nationalistic world are actively attempted to be implemented. It also happens by hollowing out democratic institutions, as we have observed in some European countries like Hungary or Poland. So normalization driving on the right, as I also call it, means drawing on certain collective narratives, on certain memories, and establishing certain myths of the past. It also implies a rise of inequality, because such far-right populism is also an answer to a lot of loss of trust and dissatisfaction. We also experience what I call the moralization of borders. Some are allowed to come in and others not. Some deserve to migrate, to immigrate, and others don't. And refugees might be treated as commodities. And finally, we experience what I call the culturalization of exclusion. There is a focus on symbolic politics, like the headscarf. We also experience blaming and denying conspiracy theories, like that the world, that certain people are to be blamed for the financial crisis, or for the pandemic, even, like Bill Gates or George Soros. And we also experience what we call a tabloid democracy. That means that the tabloids actually determine and are hegemonic in determining what the agenda in our debates are. And in that way, all of this shows us that there are big tensions between the globalizing economic, social, and cultural developments and exclusionary identity politics. That means the moralization of borders. And in that way, far-right populists in some countries are very successful. Now, we can ask, and I'm always asked about counter strategies, also of a linguistic kind. Of course, again, we have to talk about content and form. It's never just the form. Of course, there's also no single recipe about, which we could implement, but there are a few, I think, important strategies, counter strategies. One is launching a different positive counter narrative about the future and not giving simplistic answers, and also telling or proposing to people that times could be difficult, but that one is working to prevent dangers like during the pandemic. So positive new counter narratives would be very important, not just accusing other parties of being wrong, but also launching other new positive narratives. Secondly, prevent falling into destructive rhetorical dynamics. That means if there is hate incitement, don't sort of fall into a dynamic of accusing and a kind of ping pong where you put yourself on the same level. Actually, you should take a meta level in communication and point to the strategies which are used by those far-right populists. I think it's important to teach and support media awareness and media competence in schools. So this should be part of literacy. So when you learn a language, you should also learn about genres, and you should also learn about media. And you should learn to challenge and to ask questions and to check facts and to ask and to compare different reportings. But even if you don't have so much time, never to just believe and not ask questions. Everybody should avoid euphemisms, trivializations. One should call things by their name and not play this game of court civility by also using euphemisms or trivializing terrible events. One should try to cut through the far-right populist perpetuum mobile. That means this constant striving for attention by again pointing to the strategies and not putting yourself on the same level. And finally, by trying to talk to people in many local, regional, national contexts, wherever you are situated, to create participation and really try to establish new relationships if it's possible. If it's not possible, of course, and there are situations where it's not possible, then you just have to look for another situation. So I think it's important always to see what also we as linguists could do. And I started talking about my talk with pointing to language testing and citizenships and migrants who come to work and have to cut through or transcend the scapekeeping function of language, which is different in different countries. And here again, linguists would be, and applied linguistics is most important to help such people and to establish different ways and norms of helping people in different contexts to get competent in different languages, different aspects of that language, and to be able to participate in their host societies. So I would like to stop here, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Wodak. I'll clap for everyone since you can't see the audience. Thank you so much. We do have We have some questions in the chat box and also in the Q&A. So I can start with our first question in the Q&A box. I can read it to you.
Yes, please do.
Okay.
And shall I take away this sharing my screen so we could have a larger screen maybe?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, great. So here's our first question in the Q&A. Mark says, could you talk more about how these discourses move from backstage to front stage interactions? What is the role of journalism or activism in quote unquote exposing backstage uses of these discourses in the shift? And do you see this exposure as part of the process of normalization?
Thank you for this very interesting question. Well, doing field work, not just myself, but other people in this, other scholars in this area, we have actually been able to access backstage sometimes, which is not that easy because these are closed meetings sometimes, and you cannot access them that easily. But there are also certain leaflets and guidebooks or guidelines for, let's say, party members, how they are supposed to behave when they are on front stage. And these are quite explicit in telling them you shouldn't insult people, you shouldn't say explicit racist stuff, and so forth. So, for example, John Richardson was able to access this for the British National Party, and I was able to access this for the Austrian Freedom Party. And in that way, we know what kind of debates are and what kind of language is also used backstage. And in times of social media and in times of whistleblowers, it's more and more the case that such backstage proposals and leaflets and guidelines become known to the general public. Yeah, and they're published by a newspaper or again on social media and so forth. And of course, also produce a scandal, so everybody repeats it. And so we know that some about the backstage. And in these guidelines, it also says very clearly, if you are in an interview, let's say in television, in CNN or somewhere, then you should never use this or this word. You shouldn't say something like that. And then they suggest euphemisms or different wording and mitigate proposals and so forth, so that it then relates more to the course civility, to sort of this cloaked, soft version of exclusion. And of course, these politicians actually want the same stuff. Yeah, they want to deport migrants. They don't want to let certain people into the country and so forth. But it's talked about in a different way, and everybody uses disclaimers in the sense of course, I'm not racist, but I have many ex-friends, Turkish friends, Jewish friends, etc. And we know all these linguistic expressions. Now, the role of activists is very interesting. First of all, they are very prominent on social media, but they can also then launch certain proposals. They can also organize press conferences. For example, there are certain NGOs which support refugees, and then they can launch press conferences and where activists talk about the backstage and the front stage. And in that way, we get to know about these shifts and we can follow them. Of course, not everything is known. What we can also observe is that the parties have programs which you can download or which are available. and where they have their ideological programmatic standpoints and stances. And again, you can look at that and then if that suddenly becomes acceptable. For example, recently there is the gender policies have become a very contested area, as we all know. And in the program, and that's actually a booklet of the Austrian Freedom Party, there's quite a lot about women should actually stay at home and not work, and in that way our children would be brought up in a better way, and so forth and so on, contesting something which I think many women want to do. They want to work outside of home. And that has become part of, that was really a marginal proposal, but has become now part of debates in the mainstream. So suddenly certain policies become mainstream or are part of debates which had been really marginal. So I could say much more, but there are probably more questions.
Yes, thank you. We have a couple more questions in the Q&A, and we also have, oh, I'm sorry. We also have a hand raised, so maybe I'll let Sarah Kreider raise her hand. Sarah, if you'd like to speak, we can hear you now.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
yes.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. This was just fascinating and just so important. So thank you. I think this may be a related question. I was really interested in the chart that you showed.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and I'm thinking about the multiple directions that the kind of movement that you're showing can occur in.
Yeah.
Here in the United States, for instance, I've been looking at ways that talk in the national media can kind of move into what's happening in local areas. So for instance, I'm thinking about conversations about race in rural America, in the media, in secret meetings, in letters to the editor, in daily conversations, it's and in local media as opposed to national, where there seems to be a clear line from the metaphors and very kind of specific kinds of discourse that we see nationally into the local media. And I think this is particularly the case when we see right-wing discourse coming from national politicians. So I guess one question is just, I would love to hear your thoughts about that kind of cyclical movement. And then also, I'm just curious about what kind of research might be happening about that in Europe, particularly in Germany and Austria, or Italy, other places where we're seeing a movement on the national level towards something more right-wing. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah,
I feel like that was a long question, but yeah.
No, I think I understand the cyclical movement well, from the local to the national and back to the local. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I guess I'm particularly interested in the national down to the local, where I've seen a shift in local discourse in the last, say, decade in the United States, and at least the areas that I'm looking at.
Yeah, that is, I think, very much the dynamic of how media and politics work with each other, and the way propaganda works as well. I haven't talked so much about propaganda right now, because that would be another 50 minutes talk at least. But of course, there are certain strategies where from the national level, media who recontextualize what politicians say, or politicians also in speeches are repeated on a more local level. Especially in the States, you have a very interesting format, the town hall meetings, which are not that prevalent in European societies. We don't we rarely have politicians who, quote unquote, come to us, yeah, somewhere on the local level. But I've always admired those town hall meetings because they allow participation, yeah, and they actually further participation. But once this is recontextualized on a local level and then also taken up by local media and then repeated, repetition is a very simple strategy, but one of the most important ones for dissemination. And utterances, slogans, even words which are repeated ever and ever again. And if you look, the New York Times has established a wonderful corpus of Trump's speeches and tweets, everything he ever said in these 4 years. If you look at the repetitions and how frequently some words and slogans appeared, then you see you're not surprised that those have become disseminated widely, and they have become part and parcel of everyday's life almost.
Yeah.
And of course there are other strategies of propaganda, but repetition of certain items and arguments, etc. And so they become part of what we call epistemic logic. That means of the common sense of a certain group.
Yes.
And that then again might be picked up by national media because they are doing a report or a documentary or whatever in a certain part of the country and shown and talked about. And so there's a certain dynamic between the national and the local or even the regional. And it becomes normalized because people use it in such frequent ways. So I recommend looking at this corpus of the New York Times because I find it very helpful for linguistic analysis. Yeah, because you can search and you can really find collocates, and it's very useful. And actually, the Washington Post has published a book with all the tweets. And again, you could, but it's not that useful because it's not online. Yeah, like the corpus.
Right. Painful, but fascinating. Yeah.
Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, thank you so much.
With other questions?
Thank you so much, Dr. Wodak. We have a question from Venera, and they said, my question is related to the current war in Ukraine and the concurrent transformations at all levels. Can we call it a reality show like war broadcasted live? And can we assume it is a result of far-right populism discourse and rhetoric?
Well, I think the way the war in Ukraine is reported can be very different in different contexts. Yeah, so there's not one way. And if you look at it, which most of us have not, we have no possibilities to do that. But if you hear it from certain correspondents who work in Russia and who tell us that the reporting about the war is completely different than in Western media, you already have two different worlds, which also use different semantics, different wordings, show different pictures, etc. And then in our world, so to say the Western world, we have many media who might also focus on very different things. So basically, I think we have very many different aspects which are foregrounded, and I think nobody can now judge and assess in any sensible way because it's ongoing. But there are many scholars who are collecting all these different aspects. And I guess once, hopefully, this war is over, we will have answers to you know, how and what has been talked about. I think that what is quote unquote really new again and fascinating is something which we thought we would not be confronted with again, and that is really the forceful propaganda. So the way propaganda, which was used in world wars, it was used in totalitarian regimes. We know all about it, and again, we actually observe Orwellian dimensions in the way Russian media have to report. And we also observe that all independent media in Russia have been now closed. So there is actually, at least on that side, a second reality which has been constructed. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't think we can say more about it because all of us are involved, all of us are watching news and media in different languages, in different contexts, which all are somehow tweaked and adapted to national interests and then different private interests. So it will take time until we really understand what kind of realities we are confronted with.
Thank you, Professor Wodak. That is actually all the time we have. Thank you, everyone, for sending in your questions. And again, I'll clap for everyone. A big round of applause for our guest speaker, Professor Wodak. So fascinating, and we're so honored that you were able to speak with us today. Thank you, everyone, for coming. And we hope to see you at some of our future events.
Well, thank you very much. And if somebody still has big or small questions they want to ask me, please do mail me with a subject line, webinar or something, so that I know where it's coming from. And I won't immediately answer, but I will answer. So please don't hesitate if you do have really some big questions where I could maybe help and give some answers.
Just wanted to quickly echo Kelly's thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.
So take care, everybody, and have a great day far away. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you for joining.